So as I mentioned in my last video, one of the things I've been doing a lot more since the beginning of the year is reading. And that's in large part to my son Kyle and my daughter Virginia. They're big readers. And around Christmas time, they gave us sort of a recap of all the books they've been reading. And I was like, you know what? I need to be reading more. And for Christmas, Kyle got each of us a copy of a book called Breaking Up With Your Phone. And so I read through that. That was my first book that I read. And recording these videos, by the way, is going to mess up my usage time. I've been able to sort of wean myself from my phone to the point where I'm down to under an hour a day, which if you pay attention to your usage stats on your phone, that's pretty hard to do, just with texting and, you know, checking different apps and using your phone for different things. I use my phone for the calculator when we're playing games and adding up scores. It's actually pretty hard to do to get your phone usage down that much. And I didn't use my phone a ton beforehand, but I found myself, anytime I had a spare minute or I was sitting in line somewhere or just killing time, I would be on my phone, either just scrolling mindlessly through apps or playing games on my phone. And so for me, my personal goal after reading this book was to just try to bring that down a little bit and to try to salvage some of those wasted minutes that I know I'm just kind of throwing away. And I've always thought, well, if I took all that time that I was spent wasted on my phone and I put that into reading, you know, think about how much smarter I'd be and how much more I could accomplish, the things that I could learn if I spent that time reading. So that's what I've been focused on since reading this book, is just taking those little extra minutes. A lot of times when my kids have practices or things downtown, it takes us 20 minutes to get to town. So there's a lot of times we're sort of in limbo. Do I take the kids down to practice, drop them off, drive all the way home, and then as soon as you get home, you got, you know, a little bit of time to turn around and go back and get them and then come back home again, and you spend a lot of time on the road. So what I've been doing lately is just taking a book with me and killing that time in between, you know, dropping off and picking up from practices and things by reading books. And man, it's been great. And I try to avoid, you know, just mindlessly scrolling on my phone instead. And so I never really spent a ton of time on my phone, you know, like 3 or 4 hours a day or anything like that. But I was just trying to use it as a way to sort of salvage those minutes, or it ends up adding up to probably hours when you think of it, and doing something productive with that time. So I've been able to do that, and it's been really great. So what I thought I'd do today is just share with you a couple of the books that I've been reading. Like I said, I read that Breaking Up With Your Phone book first, and that was sort of the impetus to start doing a little bit more reading. So after reading the Breaking Up With Your Phone book, the first thing I had to do was finish a book that I had started a really long time ago. There's Dolly again. And this book was called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I got this book when I was taking classes at Butler County Community College to get my teaching degree. I took an anthropology class, and the instructor of that class recommended this book. He said it was one of the best books he ever read in his life. And it's really about evolution of human beings and sort of the spread of Homo sapiens out of Africa, and why did certain civilizations conquer other civilizations? Why did the pace of technology and the changing of different societies happen at different paces around the world? You know, why did the Europeans travel to the Americas and conquer the Aztecs and the Incas and the Plains Indians, as opposed to the Aztecs and the Incas traveling to Europe and conquering Europe, right? Why did it happen that way? And the conclusion is they had guns, germs, and steel, which the Aztecs and the Incas didn't have, right? But then the question is, well, how did those civilizations in Europe acquire guns, germs, and steel that gave them an advantage and technologies that other places didn't have? And the thing that interested me, or the question that was brewing in my mind as I started this book, was China. Because for a long time throughout history, China was the advanced civilization, and had things like silk and gunpowder and the compass and paper, and all of these great technologies came out of China. But why did China not conquer the world? I mean, it remains to be seen. They might still someday, hopefully not. But, you know, what happened there? And so it was a really good book. It was a little slow. A lot of it got down to what it boiled down to is the domestication of plants and animals. And the domestication of plants and animals happened at a faster pace in different areas, which then gave those civilizations an advantage, which they, you know, and then it kind of snowballed, and advancement led to advancement. And so there was a lot of physical geography involved as well. And why did the domestication of plants and animals happen in certain parts of the world first and not happen in other parts of the world? And that had to do a lot with geography and climates, and the fact that Eurasia's axis is sort of an east-west. It's a long area, whereas the Americas is north-south. Africa is a north-south axis in terms of the physical orientation. And there were physical boundaries like mountains and jungles and deserts and things that stopped the advancement of technologies or the sharing of information and technology from place to place. And so it turned out it was a great book, and I learned a lot. It was a little bit of a slow read at times, and I had started this book a long, long time ago. And whenever I start a book, I will not get going on a new one until I finish the first one, which is sort of a dumb thing, because if you're into a book and it's bad, you know, you should just give it up. There's no sense to spend time reading bad books. But it's just a weird thing with me. Once I start a book, I'll finish it, even if it takes me 2 years to do it. So anyway, I needed to finish this book. It turned out to be a really good one, but it took me a long time to get through it. But if you're interested in sort of ancient history and the development of civilizations and things, it's a really good one. The next book that I picked up was Journal of a Trapper, and this is one that's been on my shelf for a long time. But I listened to a really good podcast called Meat Eater, where they talk a lot about hunting and fishing. And the guy who runs that, Stephen Ranella, he talked about this particular book by Osborne Russell as being a really good book if you're interested in sort of that mountain men era and learning about how they lived. And it was one of his favorite books. And I thought, oh, I've got that book on my shelf and I've just never read it. So that inspired me to pick it up. And I have to admit, this is a difficult book to get through because it's a journal and it's written by a trapper who, first of all, doesn't have great English, doesn't use punctuation for the most part. So a lot of times it's hard to tell where one sentence ends and another one begins. And it's just like, hey, we traveled 10 miles up this valley. He spends a lot of time out around Yellowstone and in that western part of the United States, the Snake River Valley. But it's a lot of, you know, today we traveled 12 miles up this thing. We set some beaver traps. It was cold. And then the next day we went 12 miles this way and we set some more beaver traps. We shot an elk to eat. And so a lot of it's kind of dry and it's hard to follow. But there really is some great stuff. And Kyle has been reading this book with me too, and he agreed it's a tough one to get through. I told Kyle to just turn to the back of the book in the appendix, because I felt like the appendix, which starts on page 127, is actually the best part of the book, because it's more of a summary of different things, like what he learned about black bears and what he learned about porcupines and his views on the Shoshone Indians. And so it summarizes sort of life lessons that this guy learned as a trapper. But throughout the book, there are also some pretty cool stories in here about different experiences that he had. It's just that they're hard. You got to search for them in there because they're hidden amongst, you know, today we were hungry and it snowed, that kind of thing. But I want to read you a little piece of this because this kind of stuff, like the life that these guys lived and the fact that any of them survived, is amazing to me. He says, "Here we found immense numbers of mountain sheep, which the deep snows drive down to the low points of rocks facing the south near the river. We could see them nearly every morning from our lodges, standing on the points of rock jutting out so high in the air that they appeared no larger than weasels. It is in this position that the hunter delights to approach them from behind and shoot whilst their eyes are fixed on some object below. It's an exercise which gives vigor, health, and appetite to a hunter to shoulder his rifle at daybreak on a clear, cold morning and wind his way up a rugged mountain over rocks and crags at length, killing a fat old ewe and taking the meat to camp on his back. This kind of exercise gives him an appetite for his breakfast." So these guys are climbing mountains and shooting mountain goats first thing in the morning just so he can eat breakfast. But hunting sheep is attended with great danger in many places, especially when the rocks are covered with sleet and ice. I've often passed over places where I have had to cut steps in the ice with my butcher knife to place my feet in directly over the most frightful precipices. But being excited in the pursuit of game, I would think but little of danger until I had laid down to sleep at night. Then it would make my blood run cold to meditate upon the scenes I had passed through during the day, and often I have resolved never to risk myself again in such places, and has often broken the resolution. The sight of danger is less hideous than the thought of it. He's like, I can't believe some of the things that I've done, and I always tell myself I'm not going to do it again, and then I go out and do it. So this was a really tough book to get through. I could see where it'd be a really great book for somebody who's researching, like a historian who's researching that time period, because it's a great primary source. But as far as like a light, easy read, it's not. So I'll be interested to see if Kyle makes his way through this book. But it was a tough one, but I'm glad I read it. So the next book I started reading actually was spurred by something we did with the Boy Scouts. So in April, we're taking a trip to Antietam and Harper's Ferry with the Boy Scouts to visit some Civil War battlefields, to do some hiking on the Appalachian Trail. And so I've been working with the boys on American history or American heritage merit badge. And one of the things you have to do as part of that merit badge is to watch some historical movies and talk about, you know, which parts of the movies are accurate, which parts of the movies are just Hollywood and that kind of thing. So I shared with them a mini series, a set of movies that I watched back in the 1980s called The Blue and the Gray, which I love, by the way. And there are parts of these, you know, that are kind of hokey, but they did a really good job in that movie, in that mini series. First of all, I had to explain what a mini series was, because those kind of don't exist anymore. I mean, I guess some of the things on Netflix are like that, where there's, you know, a limited season, whatever. But there were a lot of great things about that movie and things that they wove into the movie to show glimpses of history, like the railroads and different things, but without dwelling on them a lot. So anyway, one of the things in that movie that they show on the Peninsula Campaign was the Army's using hot air balloons for reconnaissance during some of the battles on the Peninsula Campaign. And when I was watching that movie with the kids, it reminded me that I had this book on my shelf called War of the Aeronauts, which I took from my dad a few years ago because he read it, and I was perusing his shelves. He asked me if there were any books that I wanted, and so I picked this one up because it was just a really interesting subject that I was like, I never heard anything about that before. And I wanted to know, after watching that movie, like, how accurate was it? Was ballooning like really a thing? And so I read this book in under a week. It was fantastic. And what I realized was that balloons, like using balloons, was way more prevalent than I ever imagined it was. But what was really interesting was it was prevalent at the beginning of the war, and then for a variety of reasons, it died out. And so the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 was pretty much the first major battle where balloons weren't part of the equation. The balloon phase had come and gone, and there were a bunch of reasons for that. One was because a lot of the generals were old school, and this was a new technology that they just didn't know how to deal with it. And so they thought it was sort of a weird thing. It was a circus act, and they didn't understand how to put it to use. The second thing was the balloon guys themselves. A lot of them before the Civil War were performers. They put on air shows with their balloons and things, and they were competitive with each other to see who, they had big egos. They wanted to see who was the man in terms of ballooning. And so they kind of fought amongst each other and backstabbed each other, which didn't help the overall effort. If these guys would have gotten together and worked together, and if the military would have adopted this and taken it seriously, it could have had a huge impact. It probably could have shortened the war. But what was really cool was they did show how air power could be used effectively for reconnaissance. There were even guys who were like, hey, we could basically drop hand grenades out of these things, and we could use them as an offensive weapon. They never really got to that. But anyway, there's a lot of really cool stories, little anecdotes, and it showed sort of the trajectory of how ballooning, there was some early interest, but then it sort of died off, and the reasons why it just never caught on and wasn't used more extensively towards the latter part of the war. So this is a great book, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in history, or you're interested in, hot air balloons or anything of the sort. Definitely check this one out. All right, last book I'm going to talk about today, and the one that I'm reading right now is called The Hour of Peril. And this is a book that was on, first of all, I have lots of books on my bookshelves that I have not read. And that's always been sort of something that I feel guilty about. When I worked in Pittsburgh, early on in my tenure in Pittsburgh, there was a Barnes & Noble right around the corner from my office. And at lunchtime, just to sort of decompress and take a break, I'd eat my sandwich real quick. I'd walk down to Barnes & Noble, and I would peruse the discount racks. And so over the years working there, I acquired a lot of books, a lot of Civil War books in particular, off the discount racks. But also when we first got married, there was a History Book of the Month club. It was kind of like, if anybody, I'm really dating myself here, the Columbia Record House, where you get 10 cassette tapes or 10 CDs for $1, and then you had to agree to buy one every month for a certain amount of time or something. There was a history book club like that as well. And I joined that when we first got married. So I got 10 or 12 free books, and then I would have to buy a certain amount of books, and they give you a half price deal. So anyway, over the years, I've acquired a lot of history books, and I've given some away, ones that I know I'll never read. But I still have quite a few. And this is one that's been on my shelf for a long time. It's about the assassination attempts of Abraham Lincoln before he ever became president. So he was killed in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, but there were threats to his life from the time he got elected and received the Republican nomination in 1860. For 5 years, he was receiving death threats. And this particular book is specifically about his inauguration and his train trip from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., and all of the threats against his life and the threats of violence. People were threatening to not allow him to be inaugurated. And the big hotspot was Baltimore, because Baltimore is in Maryland, and back then, there was no standard gauge on the railroads. So each railroad line had different widths on their tracks. So in a lot of cities, a railroad would come in from this side, and then there would be another railroad, and these were private railroads, on the other side of town. But they were different gauges, so they didn't connect. And you had to get out of your train on this side of town, take a ride in a carriage a mile across town, and then get on another train line. And that's what the case was in Baltimore. And there were a lot of secessionists in Baltimore. Maryland was on the verge of seceding and becoming a southern state. And so that was the hot spot that they were really worried about, that when Lincoln got off the train and had to switch to another train in Baltimore, that they were going to attack him and kill him. And so one of the major figures in this book is Allan Pinkerton, who was a detective, and it talks about his early life, which is really interesting because he was a cooper, a barrel maker early on, and how he got into doing detective work. And Alan Pinkerton ended up being the most famous detective in the United States at the time, and was really, his work was the impetus behind starting the FBI. And the one thing I learned early in this book, I'm not done reading it yet, but the one thing I learned early on, first of all, the term private eye comes from Pinkerton's detective agency, because his logo that he used had an eye that said, "We never sleep." And that's where the term private eye comes from. But also, the FBI was established on April 14th, 1865. That's the day that Abraham Lincoln was shot. That morning, he signed the law establishing the FBI on the day that he was shot, which is pretty amazing as well. So anyway, Pinkerton plays a big role in this book. It also talks about how he hired women to be private detectives, which was like unheard of, but they were really good at what they did because people were so unsuspecting. You know, women's roles were a certain thing back in this antebellum period, and nobody would ever expect that this lady is a private eye, right? So it talks about how he was very reluctant at the beginning too, again, because of the social sort of order of the day. But once he hired a couple of these ladies, they were like fantastic private eyes, and how he used them to, you know, get close to some of these suspects' wives, and then they end up finding out through the wife that this guy did these bad things or whatever. So anyway, I'm not done with this book yet, but it's a page turner. It's hard to put down. Right now, I'm at the point, sort of all that lead up stuff is done, and the train is getting ready to leave Springfield, Illinois for the journey from Springfield to the east. And so I'm ready to dive in and can't wait to finish this book. So anyway, hopefully there's something in there that interests you. These books, I'm probably not going to keep these books. Very rarely do it. Once I read a book, I very rarely ever read them again. So typically I give them away or whatever. The first one, Guns, Germs, and Steel, I gave to Kyle because I finished it when I was in Texas. The second one, The War of the Aeronauts, or not, I don't know if it was the second one, whichever one I mentioned. The War of the Aeronauts, I'm going to give to Kyle because it involves really the first use of air forces in warfare. So I think he'll really be interested in this one. Journal of a Trapper will be donated to Virginia's Books to Blessings book sale. So that one will be available if you want to go to Earth Day and you want to pick that one up. And the Hour of Peril, I'm not sure yet. I'll have to finish this book before I decide what to do with it. But my guess is this one will also be at the Earth Day Books to Blessings giveaway or book sale. So if you're interested in picking this one up, you have a shot to get it there, because I don't think I'll be keeping that one. But it's really good so far. So anyway, that's it for my book reviews for now. I'm going to keep reading because now I've sort of gotten into this mode, and there's so many books on my shelves that I just want to keep going. It's like, it's hard to pull me away to do the dishes and do all the things that I want to do, because I just want to keep reading, which is a great thing. So I'm very appreciative to Kyle and Virginia for sort of sparking that interest and getting me going and reading again, because I've enjoyed it so much. Or I've been enjoying it, and I hope to continue doing that. So hope you all have a good day. Let me know in the comments if there's any good books you've been reading lately. See ya.